South Carolina's path to the SEC women's basketball tournament title game is an absolute cakewalk.
You are Locked On Gamecocks, your daily podcast on the South Carolina Gamecocks, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Hello, Gamecock Nation, and welcome back to the Locked On Gamecocks podcast. I'm Andrew Lyon, the host of this podcast, and you can find my written work over on Gamecock Digest on Fan Nation. Thank y'all so much for making the Locked On Gamecocks podcast your first listen or watch for your team here today. We are free and available both on YouTube and wherever you get your audio podcasts daily. Today's episode is brought to you by LinkedIn. These days, every new potential hire can feel like a high-stakes wager for your small business. And that's why LinkedIn Jobs helps find the right people for your team faster and for free. So post your job for free at linkedin.com/lockedoncollege. Terms and conditions do apply. Postseason play is about to get underway for Dawn Staley and South Carolina's women's basketball team. And obviously, heading into the postseason, the Gamecocks are the overwhelming favorite to win the entire thing, to win their third national title in program history. But before the Gamecocks get to the NCAA tournament, they got to go through the SEC tournament. And that begins today for the Gamecocks when they take on the Texas A&M Aggies in the quarterfinals. But when looking at the potential matchups that the Gamecocks are going to have to deal with before they get to the SEC tournament title game, the best way to put it is this is going to be an easy path for Dawn Staley and her team. Before we talk about their matchup with Texas A&M, I want to talk about their likely semifinal opponent in the Tennessee Lady Volunteers. Now, some Gamecock fans might be a little bit nervous actually seeing Tennessee be a potential matchup here on this side of the bracket because the Volunteers are admittedly the one SEC team this season that really gave South Carolina a run for their money as the Gamecocks defeated Tennessee by 11 and 8 points respectively in their two regular season meetings with the Lady Vols. But the reason why I think Gamecock fans should feel confident about this game, there's a reason both off the court and a reason on the court. To start off with the off the court reason, assuming Tennessee beats Alabama in their quarterfinal matchup and meets up with the Gamecocks in the semifinals, this would be Tennessee's third game in 3 days. And obviously, for a basketball player, when you play that many games, when you play that many minutes in a short period of time, you start to accumulate a lot of fatigue. And for Tennessee, I certainly think that that would begin to take effect on Saturday should they meet up with South Carolina in the semifinal round. So I think that South Carolina, obviously having a full 5 to 6 days almost to rest up before their first game in the SEC Women's Basketball Tournament is a big deal for them. They already have the talent advantage and sometimes the overall length advantage for the most part against their opponents. So give them an extra day of rest and it's just even worse for South Carolina's opposition. Now, in terms of the on-court reason, I think that South Carolina's front court depth is quite frankly just too much for Tennessee. Obviously, Rakia Jackson, she is a star player and she is going to make a lot of money at the next level when she plays in the WNBA. But the thing about Rakia Jackson is she is your modern day face up four. South Carolina possesses a lot of players that like to play around the rim with their back to the basket and also can go up and get a bunch of rebounds. Camila Cardoso, Ashlyn Watkins, Chloe Kitts to a certain extent, you name it. And I just don't think that Tennessee's front court, especially when you throw in the fact that, again, they're going to have another game on their hands, another game that they have played compared to South Carolina by this point, if this matchup takes place. I just think that the Gamecocks are going to be too much for the Lady Volunteers in that aspect. So even despite what Tennessee has done against South Carolina to this point in the season, I think that if you're a Gamecock fan, you got to be pretty confident if that matchup takes place. Now, let's jump from that and go to the Gamecocks quarterfinal game against the Texas A&M Aggies. Needless to say, the one time that both of these teams did meet this season, South Carolina just annihilated the Aggies. They shot 76% from the floor, 54% from behind the three-point line, and 82% from the charity stripe. The reason why the Gamecocks were so successful in their one matchup they had this season was because the Aggies just flat out had no answer for Camila Cardoso. They did not have a single player in their front court that could guard her one-on-one. It led to Camila Cardoso recording a double-double of 17 points and 13 rebounds, and at the same time, it also opened up the rest of the offense. It opened things up at the perimeter. It opened things up weak side. And so South Carolina was just able to pick Texas A&M apart throughout the entire ball game because the Aggies just could not find a way to stop the focal point of the Gamecocks offense in Camila Cardoso. Now, this time around, obviously, you'd have to assume that Texas A&M's coaching staff is going to write up a different game plan for how they're going to try to at least slow down Cardoso. Whether that means they maybe double team her a lot more often whenever she touches the ball in this game, or maybe they try to take a page out of Georgia's playbook and they decide to run a lot more zone defense. Don't know if A&M is capable of doing that, but maybe at least just to create some indecisiveness from South Carolina's front court, I could see them potentially doing that in this matchup. But considering what South Carolina possesses 1 through 5 and also on their bench and what happened in their last meeting against the Aggies, I just don't see how things are going to play out differently here. So I think that South Carolina is going to roll against Texas A&M. I think that they're going to defeat Tennessee, assuming they meet up with them in the semifinals. And sure, the Volunteers do have to get past Alabama first, and the Crimson Tide could be the Gamecocks' opponent in the semis. But we all saw what happened in the CLA just a week and a half or two ago when Alabama took on South Carolina. It was an absolute blowout. The game was not even close. So, quite frankly, even the Gamecocks play Alabama, got no reason to worry about them. So, for that reason, I think it's fair to say that South Carolina's path to the SEC tournament title game is an absolute cakewalk. And they make it to that game, obviously, they'll probably await, a team, or they'll be waiting for a team like LSU, maybe an Auburn if the Auburn Tigers knock off LSU on Friday, or a team like Ole Miss. Those are sort of the three teams I think to watch from that bottom half of the bracket. So, needless to say, don't think Gamecock fans have any reason to worry about losing a game until Sunday when the championship game rolls around. Now, as far as Lamont Paris and the men's basketball team is concerned, unfortunately, they lost their chance to win a share of the SEC regular season title on Wednesday night against Tennessee. And now their hopes of getting a double bye hangs in the balance. But they only need one or two things to happen in order to make sure that they get a top 4 seed for their tournament, which begins next week. I'll tell y'all what those two things are in just a couple moments right here on Locked On Gamecocks. Today's show is brought to you by Amazon Fire TV. Fire TV is your destination for sports, from live games to highlights to in-depth analysis. Fire TV offers amazing viewing experiences with smart TVs, as well as the Fire TV stick that you can plug into your existing TV that provides access to millions of movies and TV episodes, as well as free and live TV. Whether it's opening weekend for baseball or the college basketball tournament, you're going to want to have a Fire TV. Fire TV recently created Fire TV channels to deliver a constant supply of the latest videos from your favorite sports brands, all for free. That includes all of us at Locked On and most of the big pro leagues and college conferences as well. Fire TV channels let you dive into all the game analysis, highlights, and more to keep up to date on all the latest in the world of sports, March Madness, NBA, MLB, and lots more. Not to mention great news, entertainment, gaming, travel, cooking videos as well. Check out Fire TV channels on Fire TV and Alexa devices. If you haven't checked out Fire TV channels, you should. Trust me on this. To learn more, visit www.amazon.com/LockedOnFireTV. Welcome back to this Friday edition of the Locked On Gamecocks podcast, where we cover your South Carolina Gamecocks every single day. And as always, a big thank you to each and every one of you everydayers who make the Locked On Gamecocks podcast your daily choice for South Carolina Gamecocks sports coverage. Now, South Carolina's men's basketball team, unfortunately, they just came up short against Rick Barnes and the Tennessee Volunteers on Wednesday night. They made a late push at the end, but just a few too many missed shots in the first half and a couple of mistakes defensively early on the second half led to the Volunteers walking out of the CLA with a victory, which means now the Gamecocks no longer can pursue a regular season title, but they still have the goal in front of them regarding trying to get a double bye for the SEC men's basketball tournament. And if they want to accomplish that goal, they really truthfully need just one thing to happen. Ironically enough, they need Tennessee to defeat the Kentucky Wildcats on Saturday afternoon. Now, South Carolina plays the Mississippi State Bulldogs on Saturday afternoon over in Starkville. That's obviously going to be a tough game because it's a bounce-back spot for South Carolina, but with all the emotion that they expended on Wednesday night, all the energy that they expended, the effort that they gave, had to imagine that with the way Mississippi State likes to play, which is a little bit similar to how South Carolina plays, that is going to be a very tough matchup for them, especially considering the fact that it is on the road. Tennessee, on the other hand, they'll be playing Kentucky in Knoxville, and that'll give them a chance to finish with 4 wins in a row to end the regular season, knocking off Auburn, Alabama, South Carolina, and Kentucky in that stretch. Would be a pretty impressive feat, admittedly, for the Volunteers. But the other two teams that are currently tied with South Carolina and Kentucky for second place in the standings are Alabama and Auburn. You might be wondering, well, Andrew, why aren't you bringing those teams up a little bit more? Well, the reason is, quite frankly, those two teams have very easy matchups to end the regular season. Alabama is hosting Arkansas in Tuscaloosa, and the Crimson Tide have lost each of the last 2 games, so you know they're going to want this one badly to end the regular season. And Auburn, they're playing the Georgia Bulldogs. Don't have to say more about that. Georgia has been on a very bad snide in the last few weeks in the regular season, and Auburn is just a really bad matchup for them, in my opinion. So, more than likely, Bama and Auburn will both win their final game, which means it comes down to South Carolina and Kentucky. If South Carolina wins and Kentucky loses, the Gamecocks are going to be the number 4 overall seed, more than likely, for the SEC men's basketball tournament. Now, here's where things can get a little bit tricky. If Kentucky wins and South Carolina loses, obviously, that bumps South Carolina down to a number 5 seed. But if Kentucky wins no matter what South Carolina does, here's what could happen. The 4-way tie for second place could remain intact after Saturday. Why is that problematic? Well, getting into the SEC tiebreaker rules for just a quick moment. The first thing that the SEC looks at when there's a 3-way tie or larger in a particular spot is they look at those teams' winning percentages against the rest of that said group. So, for example here, South Carolina, having played Auburn, Alabama, and Kentucky, if those 4 teams are still tied for second after Saturday, they're going to look at the winning percentages. And for South Carolina, in that case, their winning percentage would be 33.3% because they only played each of those teams once, and the only team that they knocked off in the regular season was the Kentucky Wildcats. Kentucky, on the other hand, has wins over Alabama and Auburn. So they would actually be number 2 overall for the tournament. And then South Carolina, being below Alabama and Auburn, they would fall to 5th. So you really need the Volunteers to defeat the Wildcats. Honestly, that is more important on Saturday than South Carolina winning at Mississippi State. The Gamecocks could lose to Mississippi State on Saturday afternoon and still get a double bye for the SEC tournament. But if Kentucky defeats Tennessee, then it does not matter what happened with South Carolina's game. At that point, the Gamecocks will unfortunately be playing on Thursday instead of Friday when the tournament rolls around next week. So, the 2 games that you really need to watch on Saturday, South Carolina's, and Kentucky at Tennessee, and you need to be pulling for the Volunteers to win that matchup. Now, before we wrap things up on today's edition of the Locked On Gamecocks podcast, we're going to talk a little bit of recruiting, as some big news came out on Thursday afternoon regarding one of the best players in the entire country for the 2025 recruiting cycle. I'll discuss that player in just a couple moments right here on Locked On Gamecocks. Today's show is brought to you by LinkedIn Jobs. When you're hiring for your small business, you want to find quality professionals that are right for the role. And that's why you need to check out LinkedIn Jobs today, because they have the tools to help find the right professionals for your team both faster and for free. LinkedIn has a vast network of more than 1 billion professionals worldwide, which is a big reason why 86% of small businesses who use LinkedIn Jobs get a qualified candidate within 24 hours. 2.5 million small businesses use LinkedIn for hiring, so why not join them? Post your job for free at linkedin.com/lockedoncollege. That's linkedin.com/lockedoncollege to post your job for free today. Terms and conditions do apply. Welcome back to today's edition of the Locked On Gamecocks podcast, where we cover your team every single day in just 30 minutes. Okay. South Carolina's football program, although we don't know when the start date is, they are going to be playing spring ball very soon. They'll be hitting the practice field, and Shane Beamer and his staff will be looking to see what they got with this team here in 2024. And while spring ball will be taking place, there will also be some important visitors in terms of recruiting over the next month and a half. And obviously, the one weekend that Shane Beamer would love to have these kids come by is for the spring game, so that they can see what a game day-like atmosphere is like for South Carolina, how the team operates, etc. And clearly, there are a few particular players that when they make the decision to make a visit to Columbia, it is newsworthy. And that is definitely the case with this kid, as on Thursday afternoon, it was reported that David Sanders Jr., a 5-star offensive lineman for the 2025 class, considered to be the second best prospect in the entire country based on the composite rankings, he is going to be taking an official visit to Columbia the weekend of April the 19th through the 21st, the same weekend that South Carolina is going to have their spring game. This is a big deal for South Carolina, and it's not just because of the fact that this kid is going to take an official visit to South Carolina in the first place. As a matter of fact, David Sanders Jr., he has gotten to know the Gamecocks quite well. He has taken 3 visits to Columbia to this point in his recruitment, according to his On3 recruiting profile. And there are a lot of other big-name programs that are going after him, obviously. The leader right now, it seems like, is South Carolina's arch rivals in the Clemson Tigers. That has also been reported over the past couple days. It seems like that the Tigers, who, by the way, were David Sanders' dream school growing up, they have a bit of a cushion on everybody else that's in the running at this point in time. And so, if you are Shane Beamer and the Gamecocks, you've got to knock this visit out of the park. There's no doubt about that. And the other thing is this. Look, Shane Beamer and the staff, they have not been perfect with everything that they have done to this point in his tenure. But if there is one thing that this staff has excelled at, especially in the past 2 recruiting cycles, it has been recruiting the offensive line. Lonnie Teasley's done a good job here. Greg Atkins, obviously, has still played a vital role in those efforts as well. And that is continuing in the 2025 class with guys like David Sanders Jr. So, when the spring game rolls around, this will definitely be a visit to watch. And quite frankly, because of the fact this is an official visit, and with what Clemson does in the summertime when it comes to recruiting, they host a big cookout event usually, I believe in late May or early June. This might be South Carolina's last chance to make a real long-lasting impression on David Sanders. If they don't do it with this visit, then more than likely they will not see this kid commit at any point in this recruiting cycle. because I could definitely see David Sanders going to the cookout for Clemson and then possibly committing to the Tigers at that point if they are indeed the leader by the margin that they are at this point based on what people have been saying. Because Clemson, look, say what you want about Dabo Swinney and the Tigers, but they do a pretty good job with their cookout event. They usually have a ton of recruiting success from those visits that wind up taking place on that weekend. So this is going to be a big-time, important visit, not just because of the fact they're getting David Sanders on campus in the first place, but because South Carolina, they've got some ground to make up here. So you're going to have to do it on this official visit, or else you might have to move on from David Sanders and focus more of your attention on other guys at this position throughout the rest of this recruiting cycle. But with that being said, that's going to do it for today's edition of the Locked On Gamecocks podcast. I hope y'all thoroughly enjoyed today's show, as always. What are y'all's thoughts on Dawn Staley women's basketball team playing in the SEC tournament this weekend? What chance do you give them of running the table and winning the conference title? What are your thoughts on Lamont Paris, the men's basketball team, and what they've got to do to secure a double bye for their tournament that's taking place next week? And lastly, what are your thoughts on David Sanders Jr. coming to South Carolina for the spring game? And what do you think they have to do in order to get themselves maybe more back in the running at the very top of his recruitment? Let me know your thoughts down below in the comments section if you watch today's show on YouTube, or you could shoot me a direct message on X at @ALion_SC if you listen to today's show on an audio podcast app. As always, thank you so much for tuning in. Have a great rest of your Friday and a fantastic weekend, and I'll be sure to catch y'all on the next show of the Locked On Gamecocks podcast.